The dog wouldn't stop pacing. He circled the edge of the kitchen like something was under his skin, ears back, nostrils flaring, tail low and twitching. Then suddenly he stopped. His nose hit the ground, his muscles went rigid, and he let out a deep, throaty growl right at the floor under the pantry shelf. And that's when the handler froze. Because when a trained K9 dog growls like that, especially one like Storm, it doesn't mean he found food. It means he smells death. Storm was a 5-year-old German Shepherd assigned to Officer Riley Grant, a seasoned K9 handler with the County Sheriff's Department. He wasn't just any working dog. He was a dual-certified cadaver and scent detection K9, known across the region for finding what others missed. They weren't even supposed to be at the orphanage that day for anything serious. It was a community relations visit, the kind where officers and dogs did demonstrations to reassure nervous children and build public trust. Riley hated those assignments. Too much forced smiling, too many tight hallways. But she agreed to it because Storm, oddly enough, loved kids, especially the quiet ones. That's how they ended up at St. Augustine Home for Children, a once bustling rural facility that now looked half forgotten. The windows were cloudy, the paint peeling, the halls filled with the kind of heavy silence only institutions carry. Riley had done her rounds, met the staff, let the kids pet Storm's head while he sat calmly. Nothing unusual. Until they passed the kitchen. Storm stiffened. Riley almost didn't notice at first, but when she turned around he was rooted at the doorway, shoulders tense, chest puffed. He wasn't barking, not yet, just staring at the pantry like it had growled at him. "Come on, buddy," she whispered, giving a tug on the leash. Storm didn't move. Instead, he dropped his nose to the floor and began pacing in a slow, anxious circle, nose glued to the tile. Then came the low growl, the one that made Riley's stomach sink. This wasn't behavioral. This was training. Storm had caught a death scent. "Is there something dead under the floor?" she asked aloud, half joking, half not. The kitchen manager, a short woman named Margie, chuckled nervously. "Oh, probably just a dead mouse or something. This place is ancient." But Riley wasn't laughing. She knelt beside Storm, put a hand to his shoulder. His muscles were tense, his breath fast. She looked at the tiles. They were newer than the surrounding floor. Different pattern, less wear, like a patch job, just big enough to cover a body. "Storm," she said softly. "Show me," Storm responded instantly. He dropped into a crouch and began pawing at the grout line with surgical precision. That was when Riley knew. He wasn't guessing. He knew. She stood up and looked at Margie. "Has there been any construction or repair work in this room?" Margie blinked. "No, not really. I mean, the pantry tiles were replaced a few years ago after a flood or something." "Why?" "Who did the work?" I'm not sure. It was before my time. I just started here a year ago." The conversation was cut short by a loud bark. Storm, sharp and direct, claws now scraping furiously at the same square of tile. It was the alert behavior Riley had seen a dozen times at actual crime scenes. That scent was real, and it was under their feet. If stories like this move you, real dogs uncovering truths no one else would ever see, subscribe to Heroes for Animals. Now, these animals don't just serve. They speak for the voiceless. Back at the station, Riley filed a report. Nothing official, just a canine behavioral anomaly, the kind of paperwork that goes into the void when no one wants trouble. But she couldn't let it go. That night, she pulled up archived records of St. Augustine's. She learned something that chilled her. 6 years ago, the orphanage reported a kitchen flood and mold cleanup, but the county had no record of any water damage claims, no permit, no contractor name. Just a vague invoice marked emergency floor replacement. She dug further. One name stood out: Luis Delgado, former head cook, employed there for 8 years. Vanished 6 years ago. No resignation, no forwarding address, no police report. Just gone. Riley leaned back in her chair, staring at Storm curled by her feet, asleep but twitching occasionally in his dreams. Was it possible? Could Storm have found Delgado? The timing fit. The tile replacement. The missing person. The unexplained. Scent Storm had locked onto like his life depended on it. Riley had worked too many crime scenes to ignore her gut. And this one told her something terrible was buried in that floor. The next morning she went back, this time with a handheld VOC meter, the kind used to detect volatile organic compounds. It wasn't official, but it was good enough for a hunch. Storm led her straight to the same spot. The meter spiked. Riley didn't say anything. She just looked at Margie and the director, Mr. Kavanaugh, and calmly said, "You're going to want to call the sheriff." The tension in the kitchen could have been sliced with a knife. Staff murmured in confusion. The kids had been moved to the dining room. Maintenance stood awkwardly near the back door. Storm, however, was as focused as ever, eyes locked on the floor, breath slow and low, like he knew what was coming. Riley stood beside him, watching the contractor mark the tiles. The first crowbar hit sounded like a crack of thunder in the stale room. Then came the smell. Not strong, not fresh, but enough to stop everyone cold. Even without Storm, they would have known someone was down there. The moment the first tile came loose, the room fell silent. Even the contractors who'd joked moments earlier about digging up treasure went still. The layer beneath wasn't old grout or concrete. It was plastic sheeting, the kind used in construction, but yellowed and brittle from time. Riley's nose twitched. It was faint, but undeniable. That smell, old, sour, and unmistakably human. Storm growled low from where he sat behind her, unmoving but fully locked in. His ears were forward, chest rigid. He didn't bark this time, he didn't have to. The message was clear. It's here. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, along with 2 crime scene investigators and a field forensic tech. The kitchen had been roped off, the children quietly escorted to the west wing of the orphanage. Kavanaugh, the director, was pacing near the cafeteria, his phone glued to his ear. Margie stood by the coffee machine, wide-eyed and silent. "You sure about this?" the sheriff asked quietly as he stepped beside Riley. She nodded. "Storm doesn't false alert. Never has." He looked at the floor where 3 tiles had already been pulled. "Let's get it open." It took less than an hour to uncover the truth. Beneath the sheeting, laid into what looked like a crude cement pit, were bones. Not scattered. Placed. A partial skeleton, curled into the fetal position, clothed in the remains of a kitchen apron. The cloth had rotted, but the faded patch on the chest was still visible. Luis. The name was stitched in red thread. Everyone froze. Even the forensic tech, who had seen far worse, took a beat before stepping forward with gloves and tools. Storm let out a quiet huff and lowered himself to the floor, resting his head on his paws. His job was done, but the weight in the room had only begun to settle. Back at the station, Riley sat across from the sheriff and the county coroner, reviewing the early report. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, fracture to the back of the skull. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle, but there was more. Toxicology on the remaining hair follicles showed traces of a heavy sedative, likely administered before the blow. Someone wanted to silence him, the coroner said quietly. Fast and clean. Riley stared at the report. But why go through all the trouble to bury him in the kitchen? The sheriff shook his head. It's the only part of the building without a poured concrete foundation. Easy to break up, cover up, and tile over. Jesus. Yeah. The next piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. That evening, an unmarked envelope was dropped through the mail slot at the sheriff's office. Inside, a note written in shaky block letters. He was going to tell. Check the journal. Attached was a photo. It showed Luis Delgado, smiling and laughing, arms wrapped around two young kitchen assistants in front of a massive soup pot. On the back, a faint date, April 2017, less than a month before he vanished. Riley flipped the photo over in her hands. The journal? She asked. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. If it's real, it could blow this wide open. Back at St. Augustine's, a second search began, this time in the staff break room, storage closets, and the small apartment Delgado used to sleep in when pulling double shifts. It had been converted into storage filled with unused furniture, a broken cot, and old cans of paint. It took hours. But then, in the crawl space beneath the floorboards, they found it. Wrapped in a faded towel, tucked into a sealed plastic bag, was a thick leather-bound notebook. On the inside cover, Luis Delgado, staff log, private. The entries were detailed. Painfully so. Luis had kept a running record for nearly 2 years. Notes about meals, inventory, and most importantly, incidents. He documented multiple cases of children being denied medical treatment, excessive punishment carried out by a senior staff member named Brent Holton, and at least 3 emergency room cover-ups where abuse injuries were explained away as playground accidents. His final entry was dated 2 days before he disappeared. I spoke with the director today. He warned me not to push this, said it would disrupt the program. I'm meeting with the state inspector next week. I'm scared, but I won't be quiet. Riley felt a chill crawl down her arms. He never made that meeting. The fallout was swift. Brent Holton, who had retired quietly 2 years prior, was brought in for questioning. Within hours he cracked. Under pressure, and with Delgado's journal in hand, he confessed to confronting Luis in the kitchen after hearing about the whistleblower meeting. He claimed it wasn't planned, claimed it was an accident, claimed Luis just hit his head. But the sedative in Delgado's system told a different story. This wasn't an accident. It was a silencing. Storm sat calmly in the press conference 2 days later as the sheriff announced the investigation's findings. He wore his K9 vest, now freshly cleaned, and sat beside Riley in front of a crowded room of reporters. Microphones captured every word. We owe this discovery to a dog who didn't ignore what others couldn't even smell, the sheriff said. Storm didn't just alert us to a crime scene. He exposed a history that would have stayed buried, literally. The cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Storm simply blinked and looked up at Riley as if asking, "Are we done now?" Later, that evening, Riley took Storm to their favorite spot by the lake. She let him off leash, watched him splash into the water, tail wagging like none of it ever touched him. But she knew better. Storm always carried weight differently. He didn't. Just detect scent, he absorbed it, he lived it. And even now, as he lay at her feet watching the sun set across the water, she saw the tension still in his eyes. "You found him," she said softly. "You gave him back." Storm let out a quiet breath and rested his head on her boot. Luis Delgado was laid to rest a week later. His remains finally returned to his family. The funeral was small, quiet, with former colleagues and a few now-grown orphans who remembered his cooking with affection. At the burial, Riley stood off to the side with Storm at her heel. When they lowered the casket, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, slipped away from the crowd and knelt beside Storm. She didn't speak, just placed her hand on his back. Storm didn't move, just stayed there, solid, steady. A guardian, even now. It had only been 2 weeks since Luis Delgado's remains were uncovered, but the storm hadn't died down. Not even close. News outlets from across the country were now circling the quiet town of Glenbridge. Headlines poured in. K9 dog uncovers human remains under orphanage kitchen. Whistleblower chef found dead. 6 years later, dog leads police to hidden grave. Justice for Luis, the canine dog that refused to stay silent. The town that once tried to forget what happened behind the old walls of St. Augustine's could no longer look away, and neither could the people who had lived there. The emails started slowly at first. One came from a woman named Cynthia, now in her late 20s, who said she had grown up in St. Augustine's and remembered Luis vividly. "He made us laugh when the rest of the world ignored us," she wrote. "He used to sneak us snacks after dinner, especially when we were crying. He wasn't just a cook, he was the only one who treated us like we mattered." Then came a second email, and a third, and then dozens more. Former residents, former staff, volunteers, even nurses from the nearby clinic. Many had long believed something dark had happened, but without proof, their memories had been labeled exaggerated, or worse, erased. But now there was proof, and his name was Storm. Riley sat in her office at the sheriff's department, a cup of cold coffee in one hand, a growing stack of statements in the other. Each one painted a picture, some blurred, some sharp, of mistreatment that had gone unreported for years. Physical punishment, emotional neglect, medical conditions ignored, all under the same roof, and nearly all traced back to the same administrator, Brent Holton. The man who had admitted to killing Luis Delgado was also the common denominator in at least 7 separate accounts of abuse. Riley looked down at Storm, lying at her feet, head resting on his paws. "You opened the floodgates, didn't you?" she whispered. Storm flicked his ears but didn't move. He didn't have to. The district attorney formed a special task force within days. A dozen former residents were contacted and interviewed. The State Department of Children's Welfare reopened every closed file connected to St. Augustine's. More than 100 case files were reviewed. Some had been doctored, others mysteriously lost. And the worst part? There were more victims, some whose names had never been reported. One boy in particular, now 17 and living in a transitional home, broke down sobbing during an interview. He had watched Brent Holton drag Luis into the kitchen the night he disappeared. "He told me to shut up," the boy whispered. "Said if I said anything I'd end up under the floor too." The system had failed him, but Storm hadn't. Riley was invited to a town hall meeting not long after the investigation went public. The room was packed, concerned citizens, reporters, a few former residents brave enough to show their faces. Storm sat at her side, calm and alert despite the noise. The mayor stood up first. "We gather here tonight not just to reflect on what's happened," he began, "but to ask how we let it happen for so long." Riley was called to speak next. She wasn't one for public attention. She preferred being in the field. But she stood, cleared her throat, and kept her words simple. "Storm doesn't speak. He doesn't accuse. He just points to what's true, and when he wouldn't leave that kitchen floor, we should have listened sooner." There was no applause, just silence, the kind that means something finally landed. Storm's discovery triggered broader changes too. The governor of the state announced a full audit of all privately run orphanages and group homes. Every facility would now be required to submit digital, tamper-proof logs of incident reports, and all staff would undergo mandatory quarterly evaluations. But it wasn't just policy that changed, it was culture. Luis Delgado's journal, after being cleared for public release, became the basis of a training program for new child welfare officers. Titled, "One Voice Can Save Many," it began with a picture of Luis and a photo of Storm. The story reached national television. Storm and Riley were invited to speak on a major news network. Riley reluctantly, Storm quietly. The segment played footage from the press conference, showed the kitchen floor being pulled up, and ended with footage of Storm standing beside Luis's grave. It went viral within 24 hours. Storm's face, focused, steady, noble, became a symbol of unseen courage. Melissa, a therapist who had worked with many former St. Augustine kids, reached out to Riley personally. Some of them never said a word for years, she said, but now they're asking to talk. Not to us, though, to the dog. She laughed, then wiped her eyes. You think maybe Storm could visit sometime? Riley smiled. Try and stop him. That weekend, Riley and Storm visited a local youth shelter where several former residents now lived. She didn't wear a uniform, just jeans and a hoodie. Storm wore his vest. The kids noticed him immediately. Some kept their distance. One boy, maybe 13, sat with his back to the wall, arms crossed. Storm approached slowly, then sat down a few feet away. The boy stared, unblinking, silent. After a minute, he whispered, "Is he the one who found him?" Riley nodded. "He is." The boy didn't move, but then, almost imperceptibly, he whispered again. "Good." Storm crawled forward slowly and lay down beside him. No words, just presence. And for that moment, it was enough. Later that night, Riley sat in her truck with Storm beside her, watching the stars through the windshield. "You've done more than I ever could," she said softly. "You've changed lives without saying a single word." Storm looked at her, calm and certain. Maybe that was the point. The town of Glenbridge renamed the park near the orphanage site, Delgado Park. At the center of it, a bronze statue was installed. Storm, mid-stance, one paw raised, nose pointed forward. Behind him, a subtle engraving of Luis's name and the words, "Justice speaks loudest when it comes on four legs." The old building was empty now. St. Augustine's orphanage, once a maze of laughter, silence, and too many secrets, stood shuttered, behind rusted gates and plywood-covered windows. Yellow caution tape flapped gently in the breeze like forgotten streamers from a party no one celebrated. But for those who had lived inside it, the house wasn't empty. Not really. It was still full of noise, just not the kind you could hear with your ears. 3 months after Storm's discovery of Luis Delgado's body, the investigation had evolved into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just about one murder anymore. It was about a system, a building, a history of looking the other way. And for the first time in decades, survivors were no longer being told to move on. They were being invited to speak. The state's Victims Advocacy Task Force held its first official listening session in a community center, just 5 miles from the old orphanage. No cameras, no reporters, just a quiet space, folding chairs, and a handful of trusted professionals. Therapists, legal reps, trauma-informed officers. Storm sat in the back corner with Riley. He wasn't wearing his canine vest. He didn't need it anymore. Everyone in the room already knew who he was. The first speaker was a woman named Naomi, now 34, who hadn't spoken publicly about her time at St. Augustine's in over 15 years. "I always thought the worst thing that happened to me in that place was the punishment room," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But I realize, now it wasn't the room itself, it was how no one ever believed us. No one even looked." She glanced toward Storm, eyes watering. But he looked. Or smelled, I guess. Either way, he listened. Others followed. A man in his 20s spoke about years of being locked in closets for stuttering. A woman who'd spent her teens at St. Augustine's recalled how a nurse covered up an untreated fracture with a story about playground horseplay. And in every story the same pattern appeared. Someone noticed, but no one acted, until a dog scratched at the floor. After the session, Riley stood in the parking lot beside her truck, Storm panting gently beside her. She looked up and saw Naomi, walking toward her. "Mind if I pet him?" she asked. "Of course." Naomi knelt slowly, letting Storm sniff her hand before brushing her fingers along his thick fur. "I forgot what it felt like to feel safe," she whispered. Riley's throat tightened. "Me too." The investigation unearthed more than stories. It exposed decades of buried complaints, internal memos ignored, staff evaluations shredded, and state inspections that had been signed off despite clear warning signs. All under a facade of tight funding and high turnover. But the most disturbing discovery came from a storage unit belonging to Brent Holton. Found inside, a locked metal filing cabinet, and inside that cabinet, a collection of personal files. Not just official paperwork, but handwritten logs, notes on children, detailed behavioral reports, punishment schedules, even personal comments that read more like surveillance than support. One entry, dated the same week Luis disappeared, read, Delgado. Asked about the pantry again. He's getting too bold. May need to speak to Kavanaugh. Riley felt sick reading it. They'd killed him not out of panic, they'd planned it. When confronted with the logs, former Director Kavanaugh denied involvement, claimed he didn't know what Holton had done, claimed he was misled. But digital. Forensic teams traced the editing of digital records back to his computer. He was arrested within a week. Meanwhile, Storm's presence in the community took on a new role, not as a working dog, but as a silent figure of comfort. He and Riley began making regular visits to shelters, group homes, and schools. Kids who had never opened up to adults before suddenly sat quietly beside him, whispering things into his fur like confessions at church. He didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. Just breathing beside him was enough. One particular visit stuck with Riley. They'd been invited to a teen group home in a neighboring county. A boy named Jake, 14, withdrawn, violent outbursts, had refused therapy for almost a year. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't eat in front of others, wouldn't sleep without a chair propped against his door. Storm entered the room quietly, lay down near the corner. Jake watched him for an hour without saying a word. Then, without prompting, the boy crawled down off the mattress and lay on the floor beside the dog. No one said anything. Jake closed his eyes for the first time in days and slept. Storm wasn't a miracle worker, but he was something rarer. Proof that someone, or something, wouldn't look away. Back in Glenbridge, the town council passed an ordinance to convert the land where St. Augustine's once stood into a community garden and resource center for foster families. On opening day, a memorial stone was placed at the front gate. It read, "To the children, who were silenced and the voices that found a way to rise." That night, Riley sat on her porch with a beer in one hand, Storm's head resting in her lap. The stars were brighter than usual. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked quietly. Storm didn't respond, of course, but he didn't move either, just stayed there, like always. A few days later, Riley received a letter from Naomi. It wasn't long, just a thank you card, handwritten. But tucked inside was a drawing, a child's drawing. Stick figures of a girl, a woman in uniform, and a German shepherd. At the top it said, "This time someone listened." Storm was never the kind of dog to seek the spotlight. Even after the press conferences, the memorials, the awards, and the interviews, he stayed exactly the same. Quiet, steady, always watching. While the world around him changed, Storm remained grounded, as if he understood that his job wasn't about recognition. It was about showing up. And that's exactly what he did every single day. After the orphanage investigation, Riley expected life to return to something resembling normal. But she underestimated the power of what Storm had set in motion. Letters still came in months later. Not from journalists or lawyers anymore, but from survivors, teachers, caseworkers, and families. They didn't write about the crime scene or the cover-up. They wrote about Hope. A woman from Nebraska wrote about her daughter, adopted from foster care after bouncing through 6 homes in 5 years. The girl had nightmares and rarely spoke, but after watching a video of Storm and Riley at the Glenbridge Town Hall, she asked her mom, "Can we get a dog like him?" The family adopted a retired K9 named Scout 2 months later. The little girl named him Stormy. Riley hadn't planned to turn her life upside down. But once you've helped give a voice to children no one listened to, it's hard to stop. So she left the sheriff's department. It wasn't dramatic. No press conference, no big farewell party. She just turned in her badge and filled out a non-profit registration form the next day. It was called Storm's Echo. Their mission was simple: pair retired working dogs and shelter dogs with kids in recovery, especially those healing from trauma, foster care, or institutional neglect. No therapy jargon. No press releases, just dogs and kids, healing each other, one quiet day at a time. Storm became the face of the program, literally. His profile, ears up, head forward, was their logo. And even though he was technically retired, he still made weekly visits to training sessions where new handlers taught rescued dogs how to sense anxiety and provide comfort without commands. He would sit near the corner, like a grizzled old coach, watching the new pups bark, stumble, and learn. He never barked, never intervened, just gave them space to figure it out, and somehow that was enough. Storm had his own room in the new facility, a climate-controlled space with a soft orthopedic bed, shelves filled with fan mail, and a big picture window overlooking the back garden. Riley sometimes joked that he lived better than she did, but he earned it, every bit of it. Storm slowed down in his final year. The climbs into the truck got harder. His eyes grew a little cloudy, his steps more measured. But he never stopped working. Even when Riley offered to leave him at home, he'd stand by the door every morning, leash in mouth, waiting, as if to say, "I still have something to give." And he did, until the very last day. It was a cloudy afternoon in late fall. The center was quiet. Most of the kids were inside working on school packets. Storm had been resting more that week. Nothing alarming, just slower. More naps, less food. Riley knew what it meant. But she wasn't ready. No one ever is. He walked, outside by himself that day, wandered over to the garden and lay down under the oak tree they'd planted the year before, right next to a small bench carved with the words, "Some things don't need words to be heard." And that's where Riley found him, lying peacefully, eyes closed, heart still. The next few days were a blur. Staff cried, kids cried, letters poured in. A dozen of the kids he had helped over the years returned for a small service under the tree. Each brought a handwritten note or drawing. Some brought toys. One brought a single treat and laid it on the bench. "He'd always steal mine anyway," the boy whispered, smiling through tears. Riley buried Storm in the garden, near the oak. Simple stone marked the spot, no grand speeches, just love, and the silence he taught them how to hold. A month later, a letter arrived from the state governor's office. They were awarding Storm the State Medal of Valor, one of the highest honors ever given to a non-human. The ceremony was to be held at the Capitol. Riley hesitated at first, but in the end, she said yes. She stood at the podium on a cool December morning, looking out at a sea of people: legislators, officers, kids, families, survivors. Many had never met Storm, but they'd been changed by him. Riley took a breath. Storm didn't rescue people by charging into fire or jumping into rivers, she said. He rescued people by refusing to ignore them. He listened when no one else did. And that was enough to change everything. She stepped back as the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Behind her, a screen lit up with photos. Storm sniffing the kitchen floor, comforting a child in the hospital, resting by Riley's side under the stars. He was gone. But he was everywhere. Back at Storm's Echo, life moved forward. The program grew. More dogs, more kids, more quiet victories. Some days were hard, some were beautiful, but every single day someone sat under that tree, and every now and then, a dog would lie down beneath it, just like Storm did, like he left a part of himself there, because maybe he did. Years had passed. The garden behind Storm's echo had grown lush, shaded by the oak tree under which Storm was laid to rest. Kids came and went through the facility, each one bringing their own kind of pain and each one in time leaving a little stronger. But there was always one constant. The bench, the stone, and the space where Storm once lay. New dogs joined the program, some retired canines, others rescues, all trained in comfort, calm, and trust. But none replaced Storm, because Storm wasn't a beginning or an end. He was a bridge between silence and voice, between fear and healing, between being invisible and being seen. One of those kids was a boy named Eli. Eli came to Storm's echo at 12. He didn't speak to anyone his first week, not Riley, not the other kids, not even the staff. He carried a notebook but never wrote in it, just clutched it like a shield. He flinched at sudden movement, refused to eat at the table, slept curled against the wall, a flashlight in his hand. But he took to the dogs, especially a nervous Labrador, mix named Maple, who had been surrendered after her former handler passed away. They were a perfect match, quiet, jumpy, unsure of the world, but slowly, together, they opened up. Riley watched it unfold over the months. First, Eli started reading, aloud to Maple, then walking her alone around the garden. Eventually, he started drawing in his notebook again, mostly sketches of dogs, trees, and one very particular oak tree. Then one day, out of nowhere, Eli asked if he could visit Storm's spot. Riley took him out to the bench. He sat for nearly 20 minutes just looking at the stone. Was he really that brave? Eli finally asked. Riley smiled. No, he was quiet, steady. He just didn't walk away when things got hard. Eli nodded, then opened his notebook and drew for the rest of the afternoon. That drawing, months later, became the new logo for Storm's Echo. Eli stayed at the program until he was 18. Then he did something no one saw coming. He came back. As a trainer. By 22, Eli was one of the youngest certified dog handling mentors in the state. He worked with kids just like him. Kids who showed up with nothing but a bag of fear and a look in their eyes that said, "Don't expect much." But Eli knew better. Because someone once believed in a dog who believed in a boy, and that boy, Eli, was proof that healing doesn't happen in a straight line. It happens in quiet corners, under trees, in shared silence. With dogs like Storm. Storm's Echo now operated in 10 states. Each branch had a plaque near its entrance, quoting a line that had become synonymous with the program. You don't have to speak to be heard. The quote wasn't Storm's, of course, but it described him perfectly. Every year on the anniversary of Storm's passing, Riley hosted a gathering at the garden. It wasn't flashy, no speeches, no music, just people, kids, families, dogs, and stories. This year, Eli stood quietly near the back holding Maple's leash. A teenager approached, a new arrival to the program. Shy, hands in pockets, shoulders tense. He looked at the bench, then at Eli. "Is this where the dog is buried?" he asked. Eli nodded. Did he really find a body? Eli smiled softly. He found a lot more than that. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Riley stood alone under the tree. She could still picture Storm there, ears perked, eyes calm, never needing words to let her know he understood everything. She placed a single yellow rose on the stone. "Still working," she whispered, and, in that moment, she knew. Storm wasn't gone. He was living in every bark that brought comfort, in every hand that reached for fur before reaching for help, in every kid who came in broken and walked out whole. To the outside world, Storm may have been just a dog, but to those who knew better, he was the reason everything changed. Thank you for following Storm's story from beginning to end. Stories like this remind us of the power of listening, especially when it comes from those who can't speak. Now we'd love to hear from you. Has an animal ever helped you through something difficult? Do you believe dogs can sense things we can't? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more powerful true stories like this one.